Hey, this is a Hakawati production. My guest today promotes international investment as a special advisor. He recently wrapped up almost 5 years working with Bahrain's Economic Development Board, helping the small Arab country work towards its Economic Vision 2030 goals. Bahrain is now one of the Middle East's hubs for fintech development. It was the first country in the GCC to invest in a post-oil economy, and among the first to establish governing regulation for cryptocurrencies. Here to explain how fintech is transforming the Middle East, please welcome Mr. David Parker. Hi, David. How's it going?
Hi, Nadia. I'm very well, thank you. How are things with you?
Everything is great.
Excellent.
You're an advisor for the Bahrain Economic Development Board. You've traveled around the world to tell investors and companies how great of a place Bahrain is to do business. What has been the number one concern that you've heard from investors about doing business in the MENA?
I've actually just completed a project advising Bahrain Economic Development Board. I work with cities, regions, countries all over the world, assisting them with their investment attraction. I'm actually still in Bahrain as we speak, talking to you from a beautiful co-working space called Duan. Perhaps we can come back to that later, because I do think one of the implications in terms of the future of fintech is the sort of online versus real world argument. But to answer your question, I have traveled all over the world. I have represented Bahrain in many countries, many events around the world, speaking to investors. And for me, the single most common comment that I receive from companies with regards to the Middle East, and of course we're talking about the fintech space here, is it would be more attractive if the region was one single market, as you would get, for example, in the European Union. So I know there's a lot of dialogue taking place at the moment between regulators, particularly here in the GCC, but also with other regulators in other parts of the region, about how we might make that happen. You know, how, for example, a fintech graduating from a sandbox in Bahrain could automatically then do business in Saudi without having to go through the same process again there. We haven't made that happen yet. It's work in progress, but I'm very excited about the possibility that brings to the region. I think that will attract a lot more investment and suddenly open up a much bigger market to companies doing business here.
Right, because we've given this catch name to this region, the MENA, which encompasses the GCC, the Levant, North Africa, but how cohesive is it really? And how does it compare with the EU, for example, or the US in terms of market and how connected all the financial sectors are?
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of size, it's huge, yeah? I mean, the Middle East, North Africa region, it crosses, 3 continents, over 20 different individual countries. You're talking about a population that's not far off 500 million and continues to rise. So any business anywhere in the world should be looking at this region in terms of critical mass. I also think it's a really exciting time for the region, just in terms of developments within the fintech space. Over the last 13 years, I always go back to the financial crisis in 2008. I've worked with fintech ecosystems from the US, New York, to Europe, London, to the Far East, Hong Kong. And I'm seeing a lot of developments now here in the Middle East that I witnessed in other parts of the world. And what's really exciting is the way in which many locations in the Middle East, Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and others, are really starting to play catch-up. And where I think the magic will start to happen is when the Middle East, instead of playing catch-up from a fintech perspective, starts to become a pioneer in its own right. So we start to see new innovations that are born out of the Middle East, that are developed by entrepreneurs and innovators that are either from the region or have chosen the region as a base to build their businesses.
Right. And is it important for Arab countries to have their own proprietary fintech technology? Why can't they just buy software from China or the US, for instance?
I think they can, and we see many examples of that. But this is a very unique part of the world, and I think it's widely the widely spoken language. Although many countries engage in English and other languages, is Arabic. And what excites me is when I see fintechs emerging in the region that are developing products and services very specific to this marketplace. And Sukamal, for example, is Arabic for money market. That immediately plays better to an Arabic or Middle Eastern audience than might be the case for someone coming in from the US or another market, which is a very different culture. So I think there's certainly space here for international fintechs to grow their businesses, to expand their global footprint. But I think where it gets really exciting is when we see homegrown businesses that are developing solutions very, very much aimed at the local market.
So when we talk about fintech, we're basically talking about online payments, digital banking, digital currencies, and everything that goes around that. But so how has this accelerated and these technologies accelerated with COVID over the last couple of years? What changes have you noticed?
I think we've seen an explosion of fintech in the build-up to COVID, and that's just been accelerated now because what COVID has driven many people to do, whether it's consumers, whether it's businesses, whether it's SMEs, whether it's corporates, is to accelerate their digital know-how, their digital understanding, the digital transformation. So I think COVID is really accelerating that. I mean, one example that I always give, for example, for many years in the region, we talked about the move towards a cashless society. I think here in Bahrain, that was still just something we could only dream about a year or so ago. And yet here I am coming towards the end of March 2021. And I don't think I visited an ATM this year. All my transactions now are done very much off my phone. I use different payment platforms, but sometimes perhaps through credit cards. But certainly the last thing that I seek to take out with me when I leave home is cash. Now, that's also, of course, driving many businesses to accelerate the move towards cashless. I've traveled all over the world, and the amount of times I've walked out of the airport, jumped in a taxi, and they take cash only. Well, if people stop using cash, if people stop undertaking their transactions through cash because of the risk that cash could be contaminated, then businesses have to respond to that. So again, one example of something that was probably going to happen over time anyway, but that we're now seeing happening much, much quicker than could ever have been the case. I saw a wonderful quote recently that made me smile. What's the thing that's really accelerating companies' digital transformation? Is it the CE? No. Is it the chief technology officer? No. It's the other C. It's COVID-19 that they're having to embrace this. So I think fintech is going to come out of COVID-19 in great shape. In fact, who knows? Maybe one of the legacies of COVID-19 in the MENA region will be fintech, and also TechFin, of course, as well as fintechs. We're seeing a lot of technology companies now starting to enter the financial services space. Well-known examples of that globally, would be Amazon. From China, you've got Tencent. Very excited to say that Tencent Cloud has recently announced the opening of its first data center in the region here in Bahrain. So we're seeing many fintechs, we're seeing many tech fins, whether it's companies with a financial services background or a technology background. They're all now really excited about embracing this space.
That's a funny quote, by the way. It's like you imagine a wicked master whipping all the companies into shape to comply with a new world. I don't know if that's good or bad. We know that's good for fintech companies, for startups, maybe in some ways for economies in terms of job creation, although that's debatable because a lot of the traditional banking jobs will disappear. But how is this good for the everyday person? How is this serving people?
I think when I talk about COVID-19 being a good thing, obviously we must acknowledge, the devastating impact that this has had on people's lives, on people's businesses, on people's jobs. There's no question about that. But if you look through your history books, in any crisis throughout the course of history, it always presents opportunities. And in many cases, actually, historically, beyond a crisis actually comes good times. If you look at the Spanish flu pandemic, which is 100 years ago now, beyond that in the States, you had the roaring the roaring 20s. I think that there are certainly, while I acknowledge the problems that COVID has created, widespread throughout the world, I think there are good times ahead. And I think that's going to create new jobs as well, as whole industries transform themselves. I mean, take the healthcare sector, for example. It's been very much under the microscope as a consequence of fintech. You know, we're now seeing fintech starting to enter the wellness space, reinvent healthcare. That's creating business opportunities, which is creating jobs. Education, you know, lots of publicity about education and the fact that, you know, much education has to be delivered online over the last year or so because of the virus. We're now seeing fintech starting to move into the education financing space. So I think what we'll see is a transition. These are transformative times. We're entering a new paradigm. There are many jobs, traditional jobs that will disappear, but many new jobs that will replace them. So the challenge for anyone, the challenge for you, the challenge for me, the challenge for people of any generation, but perhaps particularly the younger generation, is developing, you know, the right skills. That accountancy course, and I'm not having a go at accountants for 1 minute, that someone might have embarked upon at university. They might now look at becoming an expert in blockchain, for example, or having a better understanding of the development and emergence of artificial intelligence. So I think what we're going into is a new paradigm, but I don't see that necessarily meaning that jobs disappear. I just think the jobs market will change. And one thing that an optimistic note, if you like, is while fintech is very much about digital, we're talking here about digital transformation, I do think that digital has its limitation. I was reading an article recently by Chris Skinner, who's the well-known author, fintech author and speaker, and he was saying how digital, you know, augments physical, but it will never replace it. Take conferencing, for example. Yes, we all sit on webinars and we all get a lot of value out of webinars, but what can possibly replace, you know, walking into a conference room, meeting people, networking, having lunch, having discussions over coffee, building relationships that might last, you know, a lifetime. So I don't think digital is going to completely wipe out jobs in a very scary way, as people might fear it will. But I do think we all now have a responsibility to perhaps re-educate, reskill, and ensure that we are equipped personally for the kinds of job opportunities that I think this new paradigm will present in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree about the advantage of meeting people in person, especially when it comes to building meaningful business relationships. There's something about sizing people up with all your senses versus just seeing them on a screen that's quite different. Everything from, you know, the way they walk, the way they carry themselves, how they interact with others. You're not privy to that when you're sitting just in front of a screen and having meetings and only seeing them during those few minutes that the meeting is actually on. But that being said, it's pretty ambitious and to see how quickly these countries are investing in fintech, especially if you consider, like, Saudi Arabia has announced that they're aiming to reach an e-payment target of 70% by 2030, which is incredible when you know how few people had credit cards just a few years ago. You mentioned getting into a taxi and having to pay cash, while, you know, in the rest of the Western world, people have been paying with credit cards for decades now. But that's just not the case in the Middle East. I don't know if people realize that there's so many countries still where that's not the case. So it's pretty ambitious to think about numbers like 70% of e-payment, having people pay by cards or e-payments. But to brush on the aspect of a cashless society, what are really the advantages for people? I know I'm asking this question again. A lot of people are concerned that not having cash means no longer having as much control over their assets, over their money, also a loss of privacy. And with having these digital identities and these digital doing everything electronically, everything is trackable. I'm just curious, as someone who deals with people in these industries all the time, is this something that people in the industry care about? I mean, they're people too, so you're building these technologies,
Yeah.
but in the end, your children will have to live with this. Do you see any issues with all of this?
Well, two great points there. One relates more to the unbanked, and then the other to digital footprint. So I'll touch on both separately. I mean, in terms of unbanked, I think this presents opportunities both for individuals and businesses. I mean, a very good example of that, Beehive, the P2P lending platform out of the UAE, launched in Bahrain a couple of years ago, and I was delighted when a small business that I was dealing with that had failed to raise finance from the bank was actually able to raise finance from the Beehive crowdfunding platform. So there you have a situation where the whole banking sector has been bypassed. So there's a challenge there for banks as well. Of course, I'm not one of these people that think that banks will disappear, but they certainly will need to and are reposition themselves in a wake of other players non-banks, if you like, entering the marketplace. So I think the whole unbanked, the whole financial inclusion agenda, which is very relevant, of course, here in the Middle East, North Africa region, is one to watch. Going back to your point about the digital footprint, I do wonder, we're talking about the legacy of COVID-19, whether one of the legacies of COVID-19 is that people do become a little bit more relaxed about their digital footprint. The fact that it could actually serve, it could actually be for the better, not necessarily for the worse. Now, just think about the way that many countries around the world have launched digital, test and tracking schemes to manage COVID. Here in Bahrain, we have an app called Be Aware. So wherever I go, whatever I do, it's being traced on the app. But that allows the government in Bahrain to have access to data that allows it to better understand the virus, better understand what's going on with the virus, where hotspots might be, where the virus seems to be thriving, and take the necessary action to make the country safer as a consequence of that. Now, if you said to someone, here's the deal, keep your data, but COVID is going to hang around for a lot longer and be a lot worse, or allow the government to access your data so they can use it to manage this disease, I think most people, myself included, would be very happy for their data to be accessed. There are exceptions to that, I'm sure, but I'd certainly put myself in that category. So I wonder whether this is a turning point. And now, as a consequence of COVID, central banks suddenly start to think, well, wow. And look at open banking, for example. We could really use customer data from banks to allow entrepreneurs to have access to information that previously would have been beyond their wildest dreams, and with consumer consent, then develop new innovative products and services, new fintech platforms that actually make people's lives better, that actually enable you to perhaps get a better deal online than previously would have been the case. So I think, but there's a need there, I think, for governments to educate people in terms of what's to be gained from institutions, fintechs, entrepreneurs, governments having access to data. And of course, it's all got to be done with consumer consent.
Interesting. Let's talk about jobs again. What is the talent situation in places like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, when these companies come in, or if foreign investors come in and establish a presence there? Is there a lack of talent to fill all these positions that will be created?
I think every country in the world, I mean, even Silicon Valley, pays coders lots of money to bring people in from around the world to try to ensure that it has the necessary talent to drive the needs of businesses. So even Silicon Valley, if you like, the ultimate tech ecosystem is reliant upon immigrants and is reliant upon overseas talent. But I think the end game for any country, in Bahrain is no different, is to ensure that the indigenous population take priority as far as jobs, as far as opportunities. And that means the indigenous population needs to take priority in terms of education and ensuring that they develop the skills, these jobs of the future that we were talking about earlier. So I think it's a transitional process, but because I work in the inward investment space, every country I've ever worked with, there's always this argument for or against foreign investors. When foreign investors come in, many people will argue that they provide competition to incumbents, and that's not good necessarily for homegrown businesses. They might fly in senior executives or talent from other countries, and then the home country would argue that that's jobs that could or should have gone to locals. But I've been working in the inward investment space now for 30 years, and what I've witnessed time and time again is international companies coming in, actually create jobs for local people, but also help to develop the skills base for local people. I worked for a few years with Invest Hong Kong, to give an example outside of the region, where we were really trying to get our startup ecosystem going. And in the early days, that was almost exclusively driven by international entrepreneurs that had gone to Hong Kong. It's a great base to do business in that part of the world. But what started to happen was those international entrepreneurs started to inspire and develop local talent. And just within the 3 years, this was 2011 to 2014, I was working with Hong Kong, that I was involved, we suddenly saw the emergence of so many indigenous startups. And suddenly it became so much more acceptable and respectable to launch a startup as opposed to perhaps become a lawyer or a teacher or a doctor, as had traditionally been the case. So I do think that international investment and local indigenous job creation do go together. They do go hand in hand. International companies develop supply chains. For example, international companies provide opportunities for local SMEs to secure more business deals. So the two go hand in hand. And I think Bahrain has got it right. Bahrain, half the population is Bahraini, half the population is expat. We do see international expats, myself being one, come to the country for jobs. But at the same time, the priority for the government is always what they call Bahrainization, creating more jobs for more local people over time. So I think the international and the indigenous go together. What fascinates me, again, back to COVID, is what does the future hold? So I'm sat here at the moment doing some advisory work with locations in different parts of the world. And I can do that from my laptop, from my iPhone, sat in a co-working space in Bahrain. So if people can work anywhere, what's the implication of that for the future of the jobs market? What if a company here in Bahrain or elsewhere in the Middle East starts to recruit people from America or the UK, but those people stay in their home country because they can, because technology allows them to do so, because COVID-19 has taught us that can be the case. So although the counter argument to that, of course, is going back to my point earlier about physical interaction. Nothing beats getting the team together for a team building event. Nothing beats walking into the office in the morning and having coffee with your colleagues. So I think there'll probably be a balance between the two. But I am fascinated about the future of jobs and whether COVID, again, presents us with a new paradigm where you start to see more people working for a company in one location, in one country, but based in another.
Right. And that's an excellent point. And that brings us back also to the idea of having and being established in the MENA region. One of the advantages is that there's a common language in a lot of these countries. So when you talk about hiring workers in different countries, a company in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain could have access to workers in Lebanon or Cairo, for example, where you have specific talents or specific infrastructure. So definitely all things that will be interesting to watch as they develop. And on that note, David Parker, thank you so much for joining me today. I wish you the best of luck in your next adventure.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Nadia, and let's look forward to what the future holds over the next year or so.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
That's it for today. Hope you enjoyed this. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you can join us again soon. Have a good one.